Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our presentation on new roadway design tools and training. As Jeff mentioned, my name is Roger Kluckman, and I'm the Specialty Functions and Support Services Group Lead in the Roadway Design Unit. I'm also joined by Sherry Calhoun, one of our Plan Review and Design Support Team Leads, who will be discussing design criteria later in the presentation. Last year, the Roadway Design Unit released several new tools and training modules that were designed to aid in the development of roadway designs and foster uniformity in plan submittals, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's a brief agenda for today's presentation. First, I'll talk about our recent update to the NCDOT Roadway Design Manual, which was released in November. I'll demonstrate the Interstate Controlling Criteria Spreadsheet tool, which we developed in coordination with the Federal Highway Administration. Then I'll talk about the Building Better Title and Typical Section Sheet training module that was developed by Jordan Woodard, our Eastern Plan Review and Design Support Group Lead. And then Sherry Calhoun will talk about developing design criteria and the corresponding design criteria form. And then we'll close out, as Jeff mentioned, with a question-answer session as time allows. First, I'll talk about the update to the NCDOT Roadway Design Manual. The NCDOT Roadway Design Manual is a complete rewrite of the legacy manual. And the Roadway Design Unit coordinated with numerous units within the department and all 14 divisions to review and develop updated content for this manual. The Structure Management Unit and Geotechnical Engineering Unit both helped review the structure chapter. The Hydraulics Unit reviewed the drainage chapter. The Traffic Management Unit under Dr. Hummer and the Congestion Management Team helped review the at-grade intersection and interchange chapters. And of course, the Integrated Mobility Division reviewed and developed content for multimodal design and the Complete Streets guidance. A link to the new Roadway Design Manual can be found on the NCDOT Roadway Design Unit's webpage on Connect NCDOT. So if you're interested, please use that or just Google it. The new Roadway Design Manual is heavily influenced by the 2018 AASHTO Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets, which I'll refer to as the 2018 AASHTO Green Book, or just Green Book throughout this presentation. Together, functional classification and context classification constitute a new framework for geometric design. We should already be familiar with the functional classification system, which characterizes roadways by their position in the transportation network. Of course, the four functional classifications are freeways, arterials, collectors, and local roads or streets. However, context classification system is new with the release of the 2018 AASHTO Green Book and characterizes roadways by their surrounding environment and how the roadway fits into the community. And the 5 context classifications that the designer needs to consider when developing dimensions and design criteria for their projects are rural, rural town, suburban, urban, and urban core. Each context classification has various distinguishing characteristics that differentiate them from the other classifications. They go beyond just rural and urban and are focused on development density, building setbacks, and land usage. For example, rural towns may have small concentrations of developed areas surrounded by rural or natural areas and may also include historic towns. Urban cores are areas with high densities and building heights with the mixed-use buildings built right up to the roadway. The context will affect your project's design criteria. The AASHTO Green Book and the NCDOT Roadway Design Manual both acknowledge flexibility in design and emphasize the role of the designer and the project team in determining the appropriate design criteria and dimensions based on project-specific conditions and future roadway performance. We need to identify the purpose and need of the project in order to make the appropriate design decisions. No project is exactly like another, and no single set of design criteria can be applicable to all or even most projects. For example, all collectors will not have the same design criteria or dimensions, particularly if they're in different regions of the state. You might want to ask yourself, do we need to upgrade the entire corridor or just make improvements to specific intersections along the corridor? So these are things we're going to have to think about. There's also some correlation between the chapter structure of the 2018 AASHTO Green Book and the NCDOT Roadway Design Manual. For example, Chapter 2 in the Green Book is titled Design Controls and Criteria, while Chapter 2 in the Roadway Design Manual is titled General Design Criteria. Another example would be Green Book Chapter 3 being titled Design Elements, and Roadway Design Manual Chapter 3 being titled Elements of Design. So you'll see a correlation between the Green Book and the Roadway Design Manual. We've also updated numerous tables and figures throughout the Roadway Design Manual to correspond with the 2018 AASHTO Green Book and the AASHTO 2011 Roadside Design Guide. So be prepared for some changes there. The Roadway Design Manual also stresses the need to consider the design for all modes of transportation. We no longer just consider automobiles and trucks, but transit, bicycles, and pedestrians in the design of our facilities. The department would like to advance multimodal design on all of our projects, and we will continue to provide new and updated multimodal guidance in years to come. The transit content is heavily influenced by the NCDOT Transit Street Design Guide. The bicycle content is based on the AASHTO Guide for the Development of Bicycle Facilities. An updated edition of the AASHTO Bicycle Guide is currently under development. Pedestrian content is based on the AASHTO Guide for the Planning, Design, and Operation of Pedestrian Facilities. An updated version of the AASHTO Pedestrian Guide was just released this past December. So we'll need to perform some updates to the pedestrian content, as well as most likely the bicycle content in the Road Design Manual over the next several months. I also want to stress that we want the new Roadway Design Manual to be a living document. That's very important. That is updated periodically. We're currently working on several revisions right now and updates that we hope to release late next month. AASHTO has also developed a revised design process to address 3 specific project types. This revised design process is implemented on a preliminary basis. The first of the 3 types is new location projects, where all or most of the project is on new alignment. Using Green Book criteria for new location projects should be more practical due to the minimal project constraints on new location projects as compared to reconstruction and construction on existing roads. Reconstruction projects cover changes in the basic roadway type. A good example of this would be upgrading a 2-lane roadway to a 4-lane divided facility. The use of Green Book criteria is desirable, but we do recognize that may not be practical and encourage flexibility in selecting design criteria on reconstruction projects. And finally, let's talk about construction on existing roads. 3R projects fall under this definition, but it's much broader than that. Construction of existing roads also includes projects that are intended to reduce current or anticipated traffic congestion and crash patterns. And we're going to have to go into a little bit further detail on what that means, at least for the department. The design process is also centered around a performance-based practical design approach where geometric design improvements are made as part of the project or those appropriate to the project's purpose and need, which in turn is developed to address specific aspects of roadway performance that are in need of improvement for that particular project. This is larger than just roadway design. This involves coordination with other disciplines within the department and, of course, the division that the project is located. It's an holistic approach that uses traffic operations, safety, and cost effectiveness to define the parameters used in performance-based practical design. There's also an updated 3R guidance in NCHRP 876, which focuses on a cost-effectiveness approach with a cost-benefit analysis tool. The department must redefine what that means, and we're currently in the process of updating our own 3R guidelines, which we hope to release later this year. And finally, I want to stress the use of engineering judgment during all stages of design on your projects, and the importance of documenting all design decisions as well. I wanted to briefly show how the new Roadway Design Manual is organized. It is separated into 2 parts. Part 1, general design information, and Part 2, plan preparation procedures. This is very similar, or almost identical to the structure of the legacy Roadway Design Manual. Part 1 focuses on design elements and design criteria. while Part 2 focuses on the preparation of roadway plans, specifications, and estimates. We have attempted to consolidate and organize information to make it easier to find. We've also made an effort to reduce the duplication of information within the manual and make references to applicable sections within the manual as well as outside resource documents that can point you towards additional resources that might be helpful to you. We also made the decision to reference guidance documents rather than reproduce this content in the roadway design manual, since these guidance documents are updated periodically, and there are also copyright concerns with duplicating figures, tables, and content from outside resources. Part 1 of the updated roadway design manual is very similar to the legacy roadway design manual, and some of the chapters should look very familiar to you. For instance, the structures, drainage, at-grade intersection, and interchange chapters are found in both the legacy roadway design manual and the new roadway design manual. One of the major differences is in the legacy roadway design manual, much of your design criteria content was found in Part 1, Chapter 1. But in the new roadway design manual, we kind of spread that information out. It's now located in 3 chapters. Those are Chapters 2, General Design Criteria, Chapter 3, Design Elements, and Chapter 4, Cross-Section Elements. For Part 2 of the roadway design manual, we made an effort to consolidate content. There were 24 chapters in the legacy roadway design manual in Part 2, and now we only have 7 in the new roadway design manual. And Chapter 3, Plan Preparation Guidelines, based on my memory, I think we've included information from 7 of the legacy chapters just in that chapter alone. I'd like to briefly discuss some of the significant changes in the new roadway design manual. In Part 1, Chapter 6, Roadside Barriers, is based on the 2011 AASHTO Roadside Design Guide, and replaces Chapter 3, Guardrail Barriers and Attenuators, that was found in the legacy roadway design manual. And we're currently working with the NCDOT Guardrail Committee to develop new details and standard drawings related to roadside barriers, primarily mesh-compliant guardrail and high-tension cable barrier systems. So be on the lookout for some changes regarding roadside barriers in the future. We've also made significant changes to Part 2, Chapter 5, Estimates and Computations, which is far more detailed than the information that was found in the legacy roadway design manual. And that was originally found in Chapter 11 in Part 1, which was titled Computations. This chapter also includes guidance to develop estimates at all stages of design and is focused on the project delivery network, the PDN. We made significant changes to Part 2, Chapter 6, Roadway Lighting Electrical. This is a complete rewrite from what the lighting electrical content was in the legacy roadway design manual. And it reflects current lighting electrical practices and policies. We've also included updated design exception preparation guidelines in Part 2, Chapter 7. Chapter 7 covers the design exception process and the need for a design exception. It also outlines the controlling criteria to be used, which I'll cover in more detail when I discuss the Interstate Controlling Criteria Spreadsheet tool, which will be coming up next. One of the most significant changes in the design exception guidelines is for projects with a design speed greater than or equal to 50 miles per hour. We're now using 10 controlling criteria rather than the 13 that you're probably used to using in the past. And for projects with a design speed of less than 50 miles per hour, there will only be 2 controlling criteria, which are design speed and design loading structural capacity. We will still require you to list the other 8 criteria when you're filling out the design exception checklist, but you only need a design exception for design speed and design structural or design loading structural capacity if your design speeds are less than 50 miles per hour. The design exception preparation guidelines also provides guidance on how to complete the design exception checklist and the design exception form, and also includes several examples of design exceptions that you could use. We want to stress that that a design exception is okay as long as it's properly documented. Design exception may be warranted based on the project's context and identified needs. So don't be afraid of a design exception. It's not something you have to avoid. The updated roadway design manual is not perfect. Some guidance may not be as clear as intended, and we also may have left some content out that was found in the legacy roadway design manual. So if you do have content or comments, we would prefer that you use the contact form, which is found in the lower right-hand side of the Roadway Design Manual's webpage. This contact form will allow us to better track and document all comments that are coming in. To help us improve the manual, we would also greatly appreciate any feedback and comments that you have. I mentioned previously the new Roadway Design Manual is a living document, and we intend to update it regularly. We have committed ourselves to update the manual at least every 6 months, but we can actually update any section in the manual at any time we want, usually within a matter of days. Feel free to call us or email us if you have any comments, but I want to stress that if you have any comments regarding the Roadway Design Manual, please use the contact form. It's the best way for us to track those comments. Now let's transition over to the new Interstate Controlling Criteria Spreadsheet tool, which we developed in coordination with the Federal Highway Administration's North Carolina Division. I have included a link to the Interstate Controlling Criteria Spreadsheet in this slide. The ICCC Spreadsheet was developed as a tool to aid in identifying potential design exceptions on interstate projects. It is not intended to supersede engineering judgment, and it's not required but encouraged on all interstate projects since it can help identify potential design exceptions early in the plan development process. I'd like to stress that any decisions made in determining design criteria on any project should be properly documented. That's going to be a recurring theme from now on. We want you to document your designs. We do have a desire to develop new tools to address criteria and standards for arterials, collectors, and local roads or streets. So be on the lookout for new training modules and tools in the near future. As I mentioned, the ICCC Spreadsheet tool is intended for all interstate projects with the exception of 3R projects. The designer must demonstrate that the design standards are met based on the 2018 AASHTO Green Book, as well as the 2016 AASHTO Policy on Design Standards for the Interstate System. If the standards cannot be met, a design exception is required. I'm going to repeat this. If standards cannot be met, a design exception is required. As previously mentioned, the updated design exception preparation guidelines can be found in the new Roadway Design Manual in Part 2, Chapter 7. There are 10 controlling criteria that need to be evaluated on interstate projects. They include design speed, lane width, shoulder width, super elevation, horizontal curve radius, super elevation rate, stopping sight distance for horizontal curves and crest vertical curves. I want to note that we no longer are required to evaluate the stopping sight distance on sag vertical curves. The remaining criteria are maximum grade, cross slope, vertical clearance, and design loading structural capacity. The 10 controlling criteria listed are applicable for interstate projects, as well as any project that has a design speed greater than 50 miles per hour. The ICCC Spreadsheet tool also evaluates paved shoulder widths. However, the paved shoulder width is not one of the 10 controlling criteria and does not require a design exception. Its presence in the spreadsheet tool is to denote whether the paved shoulder width meets either AASHTO or the NCDOT paved shoulder policy. And so that discussions can be made with FHWA and the project team if standards can not be met, particularly early in the plan development process. Now I'll take a short break from the slides while I perform a demonstration of the new ICCC spreadsheet. So just give me a moment. All right. The Interstate Controlling Criteria Spreadsheet has several worksheets, actually 14 to be exact. There's an introduction worksheet, which covers the intended use of the spreadsheet tool. I highly recommend that you read the introduction worksheet thoroughly prior to using the spreadsheet. We also list the standards that need to be met, which are currently the 2018 AASHTO Policy on Geometric Design of Highways and Streets and the 2016 Policy on Design Standards for the Interstate System. We also include references to the new Roadway Design Manual, and it's usually used as a comparison between NCDOT and AASHTO criteria throughout the 10 controlling criteria. We also briefly list what the 10 controlling criteria are, and we also reference that a design exception is required if you cannot meet any of those criteria. There's a documentation worksheet. that the engineer should use to document design decisions. The engineer should use sound engineering judgment in selecting the design criteria, and the engineer should document all design decisions, not just design criteria that require a design exception. I want to stress that when you're entering your design decisions made, try to be as thorough as possible, because this information will be moved forward, particularly as you're preparing the design exception request forms. There are also 10 worksheets to cover each of the 10 controlling criteria, and we also have a worksheet to cover the paved shoulder width. And the final worksheet is our checklist worksheet, which kind of gives you a summary of the whether the 10 controlling criteria meet standards or not. And we also list the paved shoulder width exceptions to denote whether it meets AASHTO and/or NCDOT paved shoulder policy. Let's take a closer look at our design speed worksheet. All criteria worksheets are formatted in a consistent format. There's usually an introduction and directions at the top explaining how to enter information on the worksheet. We have a table on all worksheets that are used to enter and display information. The table is color-coded. The columns are color-coded. The light blue shaded areas denote cells that you will have to manually enter. Those are cells B, G, and H, at least on this particular design speed worksheet. The light green tabs denote drop-down menus. I want you to pay particular attention when you're selecting criteria off the drop-down menu, because that will determine what your minimum AASHTO requirements are. And then the white shaded areas denote cells that are automatically filled in as you populate the spreadsheet. We also have tables at the bottom of the worksheet that denote the AASHTO and/or NCDOT criteria that are typically used in the formulas on the spreadsheet. I want you to pay particular attention to notes on these spreadsheets, because they're very important. They give you direction on how you're supposed to interpret the spreadsheet and where you're supposed to gather the information from. For example, for the AASHTO minimum ramp loop design speed, we have a note: enter the AASHTO minimum design speeds for ramps and loops manually based on table 10-1 below. And of course, if you go to table 10-1, it's from the AASHTO 2018 Green Book. And there are also notes that you may find on each of the tables from the reference documents as well. In this case, we have another note based on the upper range is use upper range ramp design speeds when possible. Of course, you may not be able to do that, so you may have to drop to the mid-range or lower range depending on your project and the purpose and need. So please pay attention to the notes. I'll not go into detail on all the slides, but I will cover some of the slides briefly. Let's move over to the total shoulder width slide. On the total shoulder width slide, I want you to pay attention to the drop-down options for functional classification. You'll notice that there are two sets of functional classifications for interstate and freeways. We have a standard interstate and freeway, and then we have an interstate and freeway with DHV greater than 500. And as you notice, if I change the functional classification of the L to just interstate, you'll notice that the AASHTO minimum outside total shoulder width just got reduced by 2 feet. So please pay attention when you're entering information using the drop-down menus, because they will definitely affect the minimum design criteria. Let's move over to the paved shoulder widths. On paved shoulder width worksheet, we evaluate the paved shoulder widths for both the median and outside paved shoulders. And as you can see, we also compare the NCDOT paved shoulder policy requirements to AASHTO requirements. So that's something you want to pay attention to. Let's see, moving down, let's move towards the stopping sight distance worksheet. As I mentioned before, for the stopping sight distance criteria, we only evaluate the stopping sight distance for horizontal curves and crest vertical curves. So we no longer have to worry about the stopping sight distance for sag vertical curves. So that's something you really want to pay attention to. And finally, let's move over to the checklist tab. As I mentioned before, the checklist tab will show which of the 10 controlling criteria did not meet standards, whether it be AASHTO or the NCDOT standards. And we'll also reference the paved shoulder widths on whether there's an exception with the NCDOT or AASHTO policies. Let me do a quick demonstration of entering information onto the spreadsheet. So I'll use the minimum design speed criteria for this one. So I'll enter a hypothetical Y line. We'll use a freeway functional classification and maintain the context classification and of urban and the terrain type of rolling. And as you notice, the AASHTO minimum design speed got automatically populated. The next step, as you read the directions, would be to enter the proposed design speed. So of course, if you entered a design speed of 50 miles per hour or above, it would denote that no design exception is required. But of course, if you enter design speed below 50, you will now see that it gets flagged as red and that a design exception is now required for that particular alignment. I want you to pay particular attention to the documentation tab because I just added a design exception for design speed for that Y line. So I would definitely want to go back to my documentation tab and document that design decision for that alignment. But as mentioned previously, you really need to document all the design decisions, not just design decisions for criteria that require an exception. That should conclude my at least brief demonstration of the spreadsheet tool. Let's move back to the presentation. Let's see. Now I'll talk about the Building Better title and typical section sheets training before turning the presentation over to Sherry for a discussion on design criteria. This training module was released last year and was developed based on feedback and comments from the plan review engineers in the Contract Standards and Development Unit, as well as discussions with several division reviewers. And as the title suggests, it focuses on common errors with the title and typical section sheets. You can access this training module by clicking on the link provided in the slide. More detailed guidance on title sheets can now be found in Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 3.2, titled Title Sheet in the new Roadway Design Manual. The new Roadway Design Manual was not released at the time this training module was released. Actually additional information, I'd highly recommend that you review Chapter 3 and Part 2 of the new Roadway Design Manual. For title sheets, the training module covered 7 common errors. These include the type of work and location information on the title sheet not matching the information shown on the 12-month tentative let list. Also, the project identification numbers, which are your WBS elements, and federal aid numbers, not matching SAP. I highly recommend that you coordinate and contact your NCDOT project manager to confirm that you have the correct project identifications on your project prior to final plan turn-in. Other common errors include the stationing information on the title sheet, not matching the stationing shown on the typical section sheets, plan sheets, and profile sheets. This involves the begin NTIP project stations, the begin in construction stations, begin in bridge stations, as well as the culvert locations. Other common errors with the title sheet include the north arrow not matching the datum description in the right-of-way plans, the design year traffic calculated incorrectly, and the incorrect functional classification and tier listed in the design data block on your title sheet. We've also encountered errors in the calculation of the project length and incorrect contact information listed on the title sheet, primarily related to not including the most current NCDOT project manager, at least on your title sheet. A lot of projects have been shelved, so pay attention. Make sure you update all your information on your plans, including your title sheet. We've also identified numerous common errors on typical section sheets. Of course, more detailed guidance can now be found in Part 2, Chapter 3, Section 3.5, which is titled Typical Sections and Payment Schedule in the new Roadway Design Manual. Some common errors on typical section sheets include not providing the correct type and rates of application for your chemical stabilization, which is typically your lime and cement stabilization on your projects. It's important to review the geotechnical recommendations for pavement and subgrade to ensure you're specifying the correct types and rates. I want to point out that the geotechnical recommendations for pavement and subgrade has replaced the geotechnical recommendations for pavement design that you may have been used to receiving in the past. These are basically the same documents, so don't get confused by the name change. Another common error is not showing the correct trench or graded section on your typical sections. This is usually always based on your pavement depth. If the pavement depth is equal to or less than 10 inches, the typical section should have a trench section. And if the pavement depth is greater than 10 inches, we should show a graded section. Of course, if you're going to vary from this, a documented design decision is required. Another error is not including prime coat when the asphalt surface course is placed directly on ABC, and this is only for roadway pavements. Make sure you see the approved pavement design and coordinate with the pavement design team in materials and tests if you have any questions regarding the use of prime coat on your project. Not showing temporary pavement locations on typical sections and the pavement schedule is also a common error. I recommend you review the traffic management plans thoroughly for temporary pavement locations and confirm with the pavement design team that you have an approved pavement design for all temporary pavements. Some of the additional common errors on typical sections include not showing the rumble strips on your typical sections, errors in the pavement schedule, including but not limited to the application rates and the lift depths of your asphalt pavements. Remember, there are minimum and maximum asphalt thicknesses. If the asphalt layer is too thin, you can crush aggregate, and the asphalt layer is too thick, you won't get density. Errors with the typical section dimensioning and labeling are also a common error. These errors typically include incorrect dimensions, inconsistent labeling. Probably a good example of inconsistent labeling would be using 6 foot 6 inches on one typical and 6.5 feet on another. Just stay consistent. Clutter, as well as constructability issues with pavement design and curb and gutter are also common concerns. And so are typical sections dimensioning or typical section dimensions not matching the approved design criteria. I want to stress that it's extremely important that your typical sections match the approved design criteria throughout the project development process. We also have additional information in Part 2, Chapter 2, Section 2.1, which is titled Displaying Information and Data. It's in the new Roadway Design Manual. It's also a good resource when developing typical sections, in addition to Chapter 3 in Part 2 of the new Roadway Design Manual. I'll now turn over the presentation over to Sherry so that she can discuss the design criteria spreadsheet.
Good morning. As Roger mentioned earlier, NCDOT Roadway Design officially launched a couple of tools in June of 2021 that were designed to aid the development of roadway designs and foster uniformity in plan submittals. With heavy turnover in both the department and our private engineering partners, we've recognized the need to develop basic design criteria training for newer engineers. The tools I'm covering today are the Developing Design Criteria Training Module and the updated Design Criteria Form. We want the process to be simple, so we set out to create a training that would highlight the importance of establishing design criteria and outlining expectations for the submittals in the hope that it would improve the efficiency and consistency in the development and review of design criteria. The Developing Design Criteria Training module is a narrated PowerPoint show that can be found in the Design Resources section of the Roadway Design page on Connect. Currently, the training module can be found in the top 5 list of new forms, guidelines, and manuals. Let's see. You will note that and that's highlighted by the red arrow there. Right below that, there's an Excel file named Design Criteria Form. Since the top 5 list does change, I've also noted the path to the actual location and included a link to each on the right side of the page. So for the design criteria form, you're going to be on Connect and go under Projects and Roadway Design. You're going to click on Design Resources. And down below where this top 5 list is the actual forms, guidelines, and manuals section. And you'll pick the resource type forms and find the file called Design Criteria Form. Likewise, for the Developing Design Criteria PowerPoint, you'll be looking under, instead of the resource type of forms, you'll be looking for resource type guidelines and be looking for Developing Design Criteria Part 1-Final. The training module covers the importance of developing design criteria and defines 3 major parts of the design criteria submittal package, which are the design criteria sheets, the structure summary sheet, and the typical sections. The updated design criteria form has been enhanced in coordination with the guidance given in the Developing Design Criteria PowerPoint. The form replaces the old design assumptions Excel file and is the version that should be used when submitting design criteria for approval. As we were developing the revised form, we engaged feasibility studies with an eye on the newly developed project delivery network. We sought to better tie the feasibility stage with the planned production stage so there would not be a need to revisit the typical section elements established in stage 1 as we move to the more robust criteria developed during stage 2 of the PDN. In addition to the simplified form, the instructions tab and the structure summary sheet are introduced in the training, and their new features are highlighted. So I'm going to give a short demonstration on using the design criteria form. So when we open the design criteria form, the first tab is the instruction sheet. This tab is new and it provides helpful information for filling out the design criteria sheets. It's recommended that a designer read through the contents on this sheet at least once before trying to complete the form. It provides general guidance about the features of the spreadsheets and some guidance for references used for specific line items. So there's a lot of information here, a lot to read through. You don't have to read it every time, but definitely recommend reading through it. The second tab is the new simplified sheet. So this was developed to be used both by those with and without extensive roadway design backgrounds. The focus of the information on the sheet is on the traffic, classification, basic terrain, and the desired typical section. While much of the information is similar to what was on the design criteria form in the past, we've added more multimodal details like sidewalk and side path descriptors. Scroll this a little bit big, but like the sidewalk and the side path descriptors and the bicycle lane width. These new lines were added to capture details that better highlight. The new lines that were added, these are highlighted in green on the left, so you can see that the new ones are there. The alignments on the simplified sheet should be the main line and any potentially major Y lines on the project that we would be doing significant work. Its application is focused on the feasibility, or 1RD1 stage of the project delivery network. However, the information will carry forward to the design criteria sheet. In our most recent update of the form on the website, there is a direct tie between the sheets. Information entered on the simplified form here will transfer over to the cover sheet. So like you can see on the first 2 columns here in the example project, I've populated all of the information there. On the 3rd column, I've entered some of the information, but I've kind of left some of them blank. And if you go over to the cover sheet, you can see that those items are blank over here too. So when I go back to the simplified sheet, I can use some of the new tools. Right here, we can just type in some of these. Hopefully I got the right number of zeros. And then we can use some of these drop-down menus to help fill in. And the idea of the drop-down menus is to help completing the form quickly and consistency, and the terminology used in the drop-down menus helps establish consistency both within the form and then between projects, so we're seeing consistent information being entered. So I'm just going to fill out the rest of these. What I will note that while the drop-down menus are available, they are not locked. So if you were coming in here and let's say we wanted a design speed, you had to scroll down, maybe not so, maybe it wouldn't be quite so convenient, right? So if we were gonna enter this in, but if you just wanted to type in 65, it also works too. So kind of going in there. So let's see. Sorry. So if we take a peek back at the cover sheet, those cells that were not filled in, they are now filled in. one of the things that I want to note here is that there is a tie. It's a formula. If you come in here on the cover sheet and you decide that, no, I don't want freeway, I want minor arterial, and try to go back to simplified sheet, it's not backwards compatible. So we just want to make sure that if you make that change, that you realize you'll need to go back and change it on the simplified sheet, or you can hit undo, and it'll put your formula back. So let's see. There are aspects of these forms that are locked, and this has been done to help with some consistency, just to make sure that we're seeing the same kind of things to help us quickly move back and forth, or do the reviews quicker. So let's stick on the cover sheet here. What we see on this sheet is the traditional design criteria form that you're probably used to seeing. The information contained on the sheet will define the typical section and the design criteria controlling the horizontal and the vertical alignments. So you can see that information. I went ahead and filled those out in the first and second column for this example. But over here, you'll see on the third column, I would have to go back and hand enter in the information to do that. The information based on the Green Book, the values based on the Green Book or the Roadway Design Manual. Those are, I'm sorry. An often overlooked part of the design criteria sheets is the references or remarks column. The revamped design criteria form has updated references for the 2018 Green Book and was recently updated for the Roadway Design Manual changes. Some of the references in the blank form are filled in with a specific resource. Like over here, I filled these in for our specific project, but on the blank form, you'll see either GB or RDM in the reference column, and that's because there's several locations to find the information depending on the classification type of the roadway, It is up to the designer to determine the proper location and designate the appropriate page, section, or table. So making sure that over here on the right-hand side that these references are filled in is an important part of the design criteria approval process. We go over to sheet 2. This is essentially a blank one. I didn't do anything to add it up, and you'll see that GB or the RDM, and those are the forms that you have to fill out. On the left-hand side, these green highlighted items are the ones that were updated. So there were some lines added from the old manual, and those are highlighted in green there. And I think I forgot to, I'm going to say over here on the cover sheet, those blue lines are the ones that are actually tied to the simplified sheet, just so you can kind of better see how much information transfers over. I forgot to mention that when we were going through. Sheet 2 is not linked to any of the other pages. So aside from except for the heading information, so that automatically gets transferred over. If you need to have additional columns, additional Y lines for your project, you can simply copy the sheet and rename it. And you can do this as many times as you need to. Just remember when you change the sheet number down here, that you also change it up here, and that should be good. One of the common questions we get is what Y lines need to be included in the design criteria submitted. If you're not doing major work on a Y line, meaning we're just making a minimal length tie to an existing Y line and not doing any major work, the Y line does not need to be included in the design criteria form submitted for approval. All right. So we move over to the structure summary. This is in a new format that we can capture information on up to 24 bridges on a single project. It's not common, but it has the ability. It was created to provide a little more information about each anticipated structure and also clear up some confusion about some terminology used on the old form. So definitions of the horizontal offset on the bridge and horizontal clearance under the bridge are provided in the instructions tab guidance on the vertical clearance is also given on the instructions. So sometimes we'll see ranges here, but we really just want a single range of what you intend to do on the project. And I'll note that though we ask for specific details about bridges on the form, a bridge typical section is not part of the approval process, so we don't, and should not be included in the submittal package. So we don't need to see on your typical sections that you're submitting any structure typical sections. Go back to our, we're gonna, okay. Once a column, and finally, once a column in the design criteria form is completed, a corresponding typical section needs to be created. The visual representation of the typical section defined by the information on the design criteria form is helpful to the review process. The training module on the website provides guidance on the elements needed and those that are not needed in the design criteria typical section. This information is also listed in the instruction sheets of the design criteria form. So the typical section shown up here shows the kind of level of detail that we're looking for here. We often find that designers are creating detailed typical sections with pavement layers, schedules, and station ranges. Those elements are not part of what we approved during the design criteria review and are therefore not reviewed as part of the approval process. While typical sections submitted can include some of these elements, the designer does so at their own risk. I want to thank you for your time today, and remember that more detailed training module and the more detailed training module and updated form can be found on Connect website, and we hope the guidance will help streamline the design criteria approval process. And Roger, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Roger and Sherry. Let's get a quick round of applause for the presenters today. Thank you. So a lot of work put into that. I really appreciate that. Just a quick heads up before we jump into questions. There will be a PDH form passed out at the end here, so stick around to get that PDH form. And if you haven't signed in already, there's a sign-up table at the beginning of the session. I forgot to mention to make sure you got signed in. But for questions, like I said, again, we are recording for posterity's sake. So the only thing that gets recorded is what's in the microphones. So I do have an extra microphone here, but let me open it up for questions, and if anything, I can repeat the question. But any questions, just start off here, and I may turn this microphone on. Hold on just 1 second.
So we have a project in Winston-Salem, of course, the Winston-Salem Beltway. What actually constitutes major work down a Y line? So previously we said it was 100 feet or more. What actually constitutes that, so we can, clarify that?
That's a good question. It really depends on, are you doing major widening or adding lanes? Are you changing the vertical alignment, or you're changing the horizontal alignment? If you're just facilitating a tie directly into that Y line alignment, it would not, require at least some design criteria for that Y line. So just significant changes in grade, horizontal alignment. If there is significant work for a significant length, I would say yes, you would definitely want to include that on your form. But most of the form's criteria information is always based on the vertical alignments and the criteria, vertical, horizontal criteria. So it's one of those, it depends, but hopefully I gave you a little, information on where you should be moving forward.
Great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Questions?
Thanks, Jeff. The sub-regional tier guidelines, are they part of the new manual?
Yeah, the sub-regional tier guidelines were incorporated, I believe, into Chapter 5 in Part 1, the structures chapter.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Got over here.
First, I'd like to say great job on the update to the manual. I really appreciate that. That's a big initiative that y'all undertook. With it being a living document and you're updating it, is there a email, or how will we be notified besides just going back and checking for what updates are?
Yeah, there'll be a memo that's released. Of course, we'll try to work through the ACEC. We'll try to make sure that information is distributed to our partners in the private engineering industry, as well as internally and throughout the divisions. Like I said, we're going to have our first test run of that, at least creating an update, hopefully next month, or should be next month. So we'll make sure that information gets out to as many people as we can get it to.
Hey, Roger. Admittedly, I have not dove into the interstate criteria, but down in Division 6 recently on a lot of the I-95 projects, we went through several iterations of cross slopes. Mm-hmm. Does the new interstate criteria sheet, does it address, and for instance, this would be going from the 4-lane typical section to the 8-lane typical section, which is what's happening down there now. The cross slope, to get the water off the road, we went through several iterations of, does it need to be an O2, a O2, a O25, and an O3, or a O2, O25, O25, where's the grade point going to be, and how are you going to address the cross slope of the ever widening section there to get the water off the road? Is that addressed in any way with a consistent application for what the cross slope should be on these extra wide roadways?
Yes. Currently, the ICCC spreadsheet does not go into that detail. We do have an option, of course, to use the 2.5% cross slopes under certain circumstances. Of course, it's not meant for 2-lane roadways crowned at the center line. We are working on some updated hydroplaning guidelines, and we are planning on updating that information. Actually, updated information should be released in the upcoming drainage manual that the hydraulics unit's working on. And then, of course, once we receive that information, we're going to go back into the roadway design manual, update information. We'll have to go back into our tools and update those to address that situation as well. But yeah, we are working on trying to develop some more detailed guidance on cross slope, particularly on multi-lane divided facilities.
Great. Any other questions? Great. In the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions for you. First of all, how come lighting and electrical is in the roadway plan and the roadway design manual?
Well, one reason it's because the lighting electrical team is currently housed in the roadway design unit. So it is one of our
no better
areas
place
of
to put it.
responsibility. Yes.
Okay, another question for you. Since this design manual is, like you said, a live document, during the stages of design, let's say I'm halfway through the project and then you updated the design manual and changed something that requires me to go back to the beginning and redo some 25% revision to the plans. At what stage, when you update the design manual, the consultant doesn't have to go back and redo stuff?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. When we do make updates, we will be changing the date on the particular sheets that the update is made. We are going to make decisions. So this is a discussion with the roadway team lead and the project manager to determine if we need to make a change or not. There's no simple question. It's going to be one of those it depends. We're really going to have to look at the situation. Is it a critical update that, yes, we need to initiate this statewide on all projects? But you made a good point. If we're far enough along in the design development process, we aren't going to want to go back.
Right.
The previous approved roadway design manual policies should be fine for those situations.
Okay.
Great. Anyone else? Any other questions? I think we're right there at it. Let's go. Oh, here we go. Get it over here. Think I just throw it? There you go.
So with the new tool and the design criteria, is the new tool the idea for it to start as a requirement for interstate projects, or is it more of just here's a helpful thing, or is it going to become in addition to design criteria and other items for design?
This is for the interstate controlling criteria spreadsheet tool. It is not required.
Okay.
But it's highly recommended that you use it because it's a good tool to be able to identify potential design exceptions on your project. And like I said, I mentioned before, we are planning on working on some upgraded tools to also cover arterials, collectors, and local roads and streets as well, to try to make everybody's life a little easier and try to standardize things a little bit better.
Thank you. Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
One more question.
Keep it coming, Zach.
For typical sections, there is two schools of thoughts on typical sections. And I've, throughout all my career with DOT, it depends on who review the plans and who's the engineer, it will tell you. One school thought that you need to have a typical section for everything. And if throughout the like say L line or Y line, you have different type of road width or something, you have to reflect all that in the typical section. And different school of thought said, typical section is a typical section. All you need to show is the number of lanes, normal crown, cut and fill. That's it. And all the rest of the features of the highway comes off the roadway plans. So that has been always a problem. It depends on the reviewer. Some of them want you to add, even if they want you to have a super elevation typical section to the left and some to the right. I mean, I've worked with so many people. Everybody thinks about typical section differently. Is there what your thoughts about what typical section need to be, and which school of thought do you prescribe to?
Right now, we're trying to move more towards removing preferences from our at least design decisions, particularly on typical sections and plan development. There is detailed guidelines provided in the roadway design manual on what we expect on a typical section. And we're also developing the QC/QA checklist, which also should provide us with information on what is required. We want to move away because if one engineer wants to add a little bit more detail to the typical section than necessary, it's my school of thought that that's fine. We just need to make sure we have the minimal standard information present on our typical sections.
Well, eventually, we're getting to the point where you got consultant reviewing another consultant plans, and that's the direction DOT is going with. Let's say I believe that the typical section need to be, just like I said, the typical section for the number of lanes, normal crown, and I like to reduce them. I like to use the minimum possible because I do understand the contractor can look at the plans and figure out whether it's a left turn lane, right turn lane, taper. Everything is details in there. There's no need to have 500 typical section in the plans. Yeah. Now, another consultant check my plans and come say, you're not showing the left. There's a left turn lane here not shown. There's an island here is not shown. There is a right turn here, and all this variable taper from this to this and all that. Who's going to decide how much? Who's going to make the decision which one to use? And
based on that conversation, that amount of detail is not currently referenced in our roadway design manual for typical sections. So that was a more of a preference comment in my point of view. So I agree with you. We need to set minimal. I prefer to go minimal. We need the minimal amount of typical sections. We don't need a project with 200 typical sections. That's not a typical,
Great question, Zach. Thank you. Anyone else? Final thoughts before we adjourn for today's session this morning? Great. Well, let's get one more round of applause for our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Well, that will conclude this session. Be sure to grab your PDH forms. They'll either be handed them out or they'll be at the table. And we'll see each other next session. Thank you, everybody.